Welcome to SpyCast, the official podcast of the International Spy Museum. I'm Erin Dietrich, and your host is Dr. Andrew Hammond, the museum's historian and curator. Every week, we explore some aspect of the past, present, or future of intelligence and espionage. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. Coming up next on SpyCast.
The CIA and the U.S. government writ large are their own worst enemies. I mean, they've created the distrust and the disinformation by undertaking such actions such as that without explanation or knowledge.
This week's episode is part 2 of a friendly debate between guests Jefferson Morley and Mark Zaid, moderated by our very own Dr. Andrew Hammond. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, make sure you check out that episode first. This week, they continue their conversation about the lingering questions surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, this time digging deeper into the Warren Commission and details of Lee Harvey Oswald's very interesting backstory. The original podcast on intelligence since 2006, we are SpyCast. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Okay, so we've got an understanding of Oswald and Cuba. I think it would be interesting to discuss Vietnam. This is something that always comes up as well. So this just piggybacks on the point that you made. 63, he wants a change of direction. Peace is good politics. One of the things that we often hear is that he was wanting to come out of Vietnam. He was changing his stance, or he was wanting to wind the war down. Some of the other theories that have been offered is that the Hawks, LBJ, they wanted to ramp it up. So Kennedy was an obstacle, so he had to go. So there's a lot going on there, but help our listeners understand, like, Vietnam, what's going on there? What do we know for sure? What was Kennedy going to do with Vietnam? Is it conjecture, or do we have a smoking gun document saying we're going to end the Vietnam War? I know we don't, but just help our listeners understand, like, the Vietnam issue with regards to the Kennedy assassination.
So Vietnam is a former French colony. There's a pro-American government in the South. There's a communist government in the North. This is a country that's been unified for 1,000 years. And they're engaged in a civil war in the 1950s. And the communists are gaining strength in North Vietnam and in South Vietnam in the 1950s, 1960s. U.S. takes the place of France, and the generals say, let's escalate. In 1961, Kennedy's first meeting, the generals come in and say, we need 8,000 combat troops in Vietnam. Kennedy says no. He gives them more advisors, but he doesn't give them combat troops. So if you look at his deliberations in Vietnam, Kennedy is always resisting appeals from the Pentagon to escalate. He's relying more and more on the CIA. He agrees that he lets the CIA basically stage a coup in 1963 because the government is failing. He wants a change of direction there. But the point, I think, is that Kennedy is not, at every opportunity to escalate, he turns it down. And when Johnson comes into office, as soon as he gets a chance to escalate, he does. So I think there's a real difference between Kennedy and Johnson on Vietnam. Now, was that a factor in the assassination? Oswald is much more connected with the Cuba issue, and, the Vietnam is kind of in the background, but I think they're similar in that Kennedy is alienated from his national security apparatus. The leaders of the CIA and the Pentagon have a very different picture of what the problem and possibilities in Cuba and Vietnam are.
Mm-hmm.
The Johnson and Nixon administrations were far more hawkish on Vietnam than what we know historically of Kennedy. And, the historical record reflects that the Pentagon was at odds with Kennedy over what to do in Vietnam and the proxy of a war against the Soviet Union. The question for our conversation is, well, then, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean with respect to November 22nd, 1963? Is that a reason to kill President Kennedy? We talk about motives. Is that a motive? Okay, sure. That's a motive. The mafia had a motive to kill President Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy had a motive that's a theory, right? That Jackie Kennedy actually killed him because he was sleeping around with everybody, and including clients of mine. Judith Exner, who was a client of mine, was sleeping with President Kennedy, and one of my Secret Service agent clients would watch to make sure Jackie wasn't coming back to the White House while JFK was swimming with Fiddle and Faddle, who were two secretaries at the White House in skinny dipping in the White House pool that existed at the time. So there are a lot of motives, but and there are books about saying Kennedy's policy on Vietnam led to his assassination. But again, I'm looking at what's the evidence. Tell me who, what, why, not and how, and there's going to be just conjecture about any of that. There's no hard evidence.
And so let's discuss the question of motive. So in the Warren Commission, point 12, the commission could not make any definitive determination of Oswald's motives. So
to me, this is a catastrophic weakness in a prominent homicide case. Somebody kills the president of the United States for no reason. That's not plausible. And so to me, right there, the Warren Commission explanation is not sufficient, especially from a man. And Marina Oswald's not the only one who said, Oswald thought of Kennedy as kind of an ordinary politician, but he liked some things about him. That's what his friends would say about him. That would be a reason to, so why would a person like that kill the president?
So let's go on to discuss motive. So we've got Oswald. Did he have a motive?
I don't see any
The
motive.
Warren Commission said that they couldn't find a determinative one. But then we've got the other players, and we don't have time to go into all of them. So maybe we can just discuss some of the leading contenders as you see them. The CIA, which you've mentioned, Jeff, the Mafia, LBJ, Castro, the KGB.
I don't think that there's any. I don't think there's any evidence to support the KGB did it theory. Organized crime was involved in the assassination. Jack Ruby killed Oswald. Jack Ruby was connected with organized crime figures. So we know there's an organized crime connection. The evidence connecting Castro to the assassination, there's far more evidence connecting the CIA to Oswald than there is connecting the Cubans to Oswald. No question. Far, far more. So, there were people who were very hostile to Kennedy's policies and feared them and wanted to end them and were perfectly happy when Kennedy's presidency ended and made no effort to investigate who was responsible. So I think that tells you what was going on was people didn't care who'd killed Kennedy. It was fine that he was gone. They felt the country was in better hands and, let's move on. A little man killed a big man, get over it. That became the CIA's story very early on. Just we now know it's not true. He wasn't a little man. He was a guy who was of deep interest to the CIA.
Where do you see motives, if any, Mark?
Again, motives, I agree with Jeff. I do not think KGB, Soviet Union killed President Kennedy. That would be nuclear war and the end of the planet. But motive, this is where people go for conspiracy theories. They look at, well, what would the motive be? Castro had a motive. It's funny. There's a great story of when the House Select Committee investigators and staff went down to Cuba to interview Fidel Castro in the late 70s. And he relished in showing them the photographic surveillance photographs that of the Cuban intelligence had of the CIA photographic photographers who were surveilling the Cuban embassy in Mexico City.
He handed out a picture of a guy taking a photograph through the Venetian blinds.
Yeah. So, at that level, it would, especially given what they had already encountered with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, sure, you can come up with a motive. Same thing with the Mafia. Bobby Kennedy and the U.S. government is cracking down on the Mafia. They were at odds. They were enemies for sure. Would it be better for them not to be in existence any longer, meaning the Kennedys? Yeah. Did they then do it? Well, now you're getting, down the rabbit hole. I agree completely. Jack Ruby had connections, low-level connections to the mob, for sure. He came out of Chicago. He ran strip clubs in Dallas. They were very much connected. In fact, he was an FBI informant a few times, at least in 1959, which the Warren Commission did not know, by the way, so the FBI lied to them. They had that information. Now, does that make any difference in the grand scheme of things? There's nothing that then ties it. I mean, there are some very respectable people who I admire very much, like Professor Blakey, who believes it's the mafia, or Dan Moldea, who's a good friend and former client of mine, who they believe the mafia did it. I don't personally see it.
Okay. And let's discuss the issue if Lee Harvey Oswald was the single gunman theory. So in the research for this episode, doing some looking around online, you have one news story where ex-researchers have found that it would be impossible to fire these 3 bullets and for everything to happen the way that the Warren Commission said. And then you have another news story 2 months later on a different channel. Researchers have proved that it's actually possible to do everything that the Warren Commission said and fire these 3 shots off in this period of time and all. So I'm just putting myself in the position of the listener, of the average person on the street. Like, where does the preponderance of evidence lie in terms of, is it possible to do those 3 shots in that period of time? Let's discuss the dummy bullet and stuff separately, but just the 3 bullets, can you do that in that period of time?
I mean, they've tried multiple times to reproduce the shots according to what the Warren Commission said, and very, very few of them, even with expert marksmen, and it's not clear Oswald was an expert marksman, they couldn't do it. You know, the other thing is, who do you believe? I mean, look at the people who didn't believe the official story, okay? They're not crazy. Lyndon Johnson didn't believe it. He said repeatedly in retirement, Oswald did not act alone. Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, they never believed the lone gunman theory. Charles de Gaulle, president of France, did not believe the lone gunman. Fidel Castro did not believe the lone gunman. You say, oh, well, Fidel Castro, he's a communist, he's an evil guy and all that. Well, the CIA spent 40 years trying to kill him, and they failed every time. The man died peacefully in his bed. You can't say he didn't know his way around CIA assassination conspiracies. So these are all highly credible people. Now, do they have a stupid theory? No, let's not talk about people's stupid theories. Let's talk about what people in the know thought, okay? Did the 3 shots go? 3 members of the Warren Commission did not believe that Oswald fired those 3 shots and that one of them missed and 2 of them hit the motorcade. Nobody in that car thought that that's what happened. John Connolly, who was hit by the bullet, didn't believe it. His wife, Nellie Connolly, sitting next to him, didn't believe it. Jackie Kennedy, sitting 18 inches from her husband, said she didn't believe it. And Roy Kellerman, the Secret Service man in the front seat, he didn't believe it. So it's just not a very credible theory. The eyewitness evidence, the photographic evidence, and the dispassionate view of informed people afterwards, very few of them believed it. So it's not crazy to not believe that. There's plenty of very sane, much better informed people than me who came to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And what's the best evidence or the best story that fits the facts of what actually happened? 2 shooters, 3 shooters, all from one place. Let's put aside who did it and the motives, but just the ballistics and the mechanics of it. Like, what's the best explanation that we have?
So I think, given the fact that nobody in the limousine thought that the Warren Commission's account was accurate, the 3 members of the Warren Commission and the man who appointed the commission didn't believe it, as well as this other evidence, makes us think that it's not true. There's a documentary that came out last year called What the Doctors Saw, and it's about the testimony of the doctors who tried to save Kennedy's life. And these 7 doctors had talked a little bit at different times, but not. And in this film, they get together and they talk. And these doctors say it was their conclusion that Kennedy had been hit by gunfire both from the front and the back, that he was hit by crossfire. So these are 7 medical professionals, again, not conspiracy theorists. They don't have a crazy, stupid theory. Dr. McClellan was a highly respected doctor, and he said there was no doubt in his mind that Kennedy was killed by a shot from the front of the limousine. That's pretty strong evidence to me. I mean, why shouldn't I believe the doctor who treated him and saw his wounds from 18 inches away? I think he's a credible witness.
And just briefly for our audience, if LBJ and members of the Warren Commission didn't believe the Warren Commission report, like how did the findings come about then?
Because it was a national tragedy. There was no solution. People wanted to get on with it. There was no obvious. It was very, people didn't know anything about the surveillance of Oswald. They didn't know anything about the testimony of the doctors after this. People wanted to get rid of it. It was a painful, horrible thing. And it was like, let's move on and just, make the best of it. And so, John Sherman Cooper told his aide, I don't believe it. They won't see, they're closing their eyes to the evidence. But if push came to shove, Earl Warren said, this has got to be unanimous. And he told Richard Russell, you can't put in a dissent. And so they went along. That's why people went along, because it seemed like the thing to do.
Look, I fully agree that many very respectable people don't believe the conclusions, but that by itself is not evidence. I mean, there were members of the Warren Commission who had their doubts, and it was the Warren Commission members who barely showed up for any of the investigative hearings. And we don't know the degree to which evidence was examined by by any of these individuals. And there are, you put a microscope to anything. Look at the O.J. Simpson case. Does anyone who really thinks O.J. Simpson didn't kill his ex-wife and Ron Goldman, but he was acquitted? And because the lawyers did a really good job of putting things under a microscope, that everything has flaws when you look at it. And the doctors who were at Parkland, their views are absolutely important. That is evidence. They are credible witnesses, but they're only a piece of the puzzle to then examine with ballistics and forensics and to look at just all the evidence all together. I mean, you've got to look at it, everything. And where I will stay open-minded is just give me evidence to the contrary, right? We can give you all these bits of evidence, right? Oswald supposedly brings curtain rods to the Texas School Book Depository building, but his apartment and where the places he lived all had their curtain rods, right? The rifle gets traced back to him. I mean, you start to have to go through all these machinations of conspiracy theories to say frame. I mean, so many people would have to have been involved. It doesn't mean you can't have doubts, reasonable doubts, legitimate doubts. I mean, I think Jeff is a very intelligent person, and this, like I said, as a friend. But we have our doubts. We have a different view on the interpretation of some of this evidence.
And let's just discuss briefly Jack Ruby. So, I mean, what's going on there? You have the main suspect for probably the crime of the century, and then it gets shot on live TV. I mean, you can understand why people are like, WTF, like, what is going on there? That doesn't make sense.
The main suspect who's denying responsibility and saying he's a patsy and is killed within 24 hours in police custody. And that day, the day Oswald dies, Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover get together on the phone, and they say, we have to convince the public that Oswald acted alone and he has no Confederates at large, okay? The president hasn't been buried yet, okay? Oswald has been dead for a couple of hours. The JFK assassination investigation is less than 48 hours old, and the two top officials in the U.S. government have sent a very clear signal. One man alone did this. That's the finding we want. And that's the finding that the FBI delivered 3 weeks later, and that's the finding the Warren Commission delivered 9 months later. And the Warren Commission didn't know the half of it. They didn't know about the surveillance of Oswald. And so this story was settled on right from the start, and all the, and we've learned since then, it came with a whole bodyguard of lies that hid highly relevant information. So to me, like, that tells you Marx says, look at all the evidence. In the totality of evidence, it strikes me as highly unlikely that one guy killed the president for no reason, denied it. Another guy came along and killed him for no reason, and that's the end of the story. And here's an important thing. Nobody in the U.S. government loses their job. Nobody at the Secret Service loses their job. They don't fire the director. They don't fire the men who failed to respond to the gunfire. Nobody at the CIA who's been following this guy for 4 years, nobody gets fired. Nobody knows about it. So nobody at this, so Secret Service, FBI, and CIA, nobody loses their job. So the president gets shot dead in broad daylight, an atrocious security failure. And the stance of the U.S. government is everybody did their job just fine. Nobody needs to be sanctioned or disciplined in any way. To me, that says the fix is in and they wanted nobody to talk about this. And because if you fire somebody, then they've got a motive to talk. So nobody loses their job and nobody talks.
So the night that Ruby dies, why Oswald dies, why did J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ say, here's the findings that we have to get? Like, is it from listen, this is a tragedy, the country needs to move on, this seems to be the explanation, let's just make everything tidy? Or is it, they're involved in it somehow?
Well,
or they have
they clearly didn't want
a
full investigation, right?
Okay.
Right? The investigation hasn't begun, and they're already delivering the conclusion. So one thing you can say very clearly is they didn't want a thorough investigation. And, not surprisingly, the Warren Commission investigation wasn't very thorough. They didn't know about the surveillance of Oswald, and they didn't know about the assassination plots against Castro. So the Warren Commission is flying blind, thanks to the CIA, and to say this has nothing to do, we can still reach the same conclusions, just doesn't seem very plausible to me.
But see, the flip side of that is of looking at, well, what would Occam's razor tell us? It is known Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union. It was publicly reported when he defected to the Soviet Union. That's in the aftermath of the assassination, even though 1963 is not 2024 with respect to cell phone and internet and things like that. Stories started going really quickly. I mean, reporters had interviewed Oswald in the Soviet Union, so they can look in their files, and over the course of Friday, Saturday, into Sunday morning's news, there was a lot of information coming out about Oswald, and there was a grave concern that maybe the Soviet Union was involved, maybe Cuba was involved. And so if you put it in that context, while I don't agree with Hoover and Johnson pushing in, it doesn't necessarily mean that the fix was in for an investigation, not a thorough investigation. It was, we need to make sure there's not going to be World War III. That is a serious concern. Now, which of us are right about that? I mean, that's why we're still debating this and discussing it now, because we have no idea which one of us is right about it. But what I'm saying is there is a plausible explanation for a lot of the cover-up, of which there was a lot of cover-up.
And Johnson says this to Earl Warren when he's trying to get him to take the job.
Because he didn't want it.
Earl Warren doesn't want the job. And Johnson says, and we have the tape, you have to do this because if these rumors get out of control, rumors of a conspiracy, then we're going to have a world war and 40 million people will die. And Johnson, by the end of the conversation, Earl Warren is in tears and he agrees to take the job. So, that was the rationale, was we can't look into this because we have to keep the peace. But that meant that there was no serious investigation. I mean, I think, the Warren Commission didn't have these key facts.
And let's discuss a little bit more LBJ and Hoover. What was Kennedy's relationship like with both of them? I mean, we know that him and LBJ never, they're cut from different cloth, different parts of the country, different upbringing and stuff, but was the animus, was there real animus there, or what?
Well, Kennedy and Hoover were not buddies at all. Hoover was not a fan of RFK Jr., who, of course, was his boss as the Attorney General of the United States.
When you say not friends, put it on a spectrum. Did they hate each other, loathe each other?
I wouldn't say hate, fearful. I would say very cautious fear.
Fearful respect for one another?
I mean, you had to have respect for one another. First of all, Hoover knew, in particular, and Jeff, you can tell me if you know more about this. Kennedy had I don't know if it was an affair, but he had dated a woman who was likely a German spy, a Nazi spy, and Hoover knew about that. And I mean, now we know more about this.
And it was a very dangerous secret because it was in the summer of '63. The British Prime Minister lost his job dating a Russian woman,
but this was in the 40s. He dated her in the 40s.
But
nobody knew about it.
But this idea that a leader was dating a communist, that's why Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy were very worried about this story about this woman, Ellen Romish, because it had this contemporary resonance of this sex scandal that happened in the UK in the summer of 1963. So Hoover had this real lever on them by,
It was an open secret that JFK was having numerous of, I told you about my Secret Service clients witnessing it, but Mary Meyer, who died in Georgetown, socialite, was supposed to have an affair with President Kennedy. Obviously, Marilyn Monroe is possibly.
No, and Mary Meyer shows up 15 times in the White House visitor logs, and every time Jackie is away. So there was no doubt that she was a serious girlfriend of the
and Hoover.
Of the president.
Hoover was amassing this type of information on lots of people, right? He knew about Martin Luther King having affairs. He tried to get Martin Luther King to kill himself by trying to leak that information. So there was always discussion, I think, in every administration post-World War II about getting rid of Hoover. Relieving him as FBI director. And everyone
backed away from it.
Yeah, realized that was not a smart thing to do. And if anyone wants to read a great book, Chancellor's Manuscript by Robert Ludlum in the early 70s, post-Hoover's death. It's a historical fiction about Hoover's secret files, which he supposedly had, which after his death vanished and have never been seen.
And then LBJ, so there's real animus between the Kennedys and Hoover and real tension. Johnson's a little bit different. He's definitely not in the inner circle. He feels scorned and looked down upon. But, and then people say, so he was involved in a plot to kill Kennedy. I think Johnson understood right away what had happened, and that's why he didn't want a real investigation and made sure he didn't get one. But, I don't see any evidence linking Johnson to the assassination.
Mm-hmm. And let's discuss also, since we're, at the Spy Museum, let's discuss Alan Dulles and John McCone, so the outgoing CIA director and the incoming CIA director. What were their relationships like with Kennedy, and what role, if any, did they play in the assassination and the aftermath?
Well, Dulles is on the Warren Commission, which, Kennedy had fired him. I don't think that could happen today on a presidential commission. It wouldn't be considered credible. And so the commission in that way is compromised from the start. Dulles is clearly going to protect the CIA's equities, and he did.
And he did.
And so he prevents an investigation. John McCone was better friends with Bobby Kennedy. They were both very Catholic. McCone's wife had died, and Bobby and Ethel kind of helped him through that time. So they were close, but McCone was an outsider. He was a Republican businessman. He'd been the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Kennedy put him in there as kind of to deflect some of the Republican and right-wing attacks. He could say, look, I got one of your guys in there. So, but that meant that McCone didn't know that much about what was going on within the agency. On the afternoon of the assassination, McCone is the first person Bobby Kennedy calls. And McCone comes from CIA headquarters to Bobby's house on Hickory Hill, and they go out for a walk on the grass. And the first question Bobby asks him is, did your guys do this? That was Bobby Kennedy's prime suspect, the CIA. So let's get this start. Oliver Stone didn't invent the idea that there were high-level machinations against the Kennedys. That was the first words out of Bobby Kennedy's mouth after he heard his brother had been killed. And they went to the director of the CIA. And Bobby told Arthur Schlesinger that McCone had assured him and given him very credible assurances that they were not involved. So That's the story of McCone and Dulles as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. And just very briefly before we go on to Mark, was Kennedy's Catholicism in any way part of any of this? You know, he's the first Catholic, you know, the Pope, all this, you know, this kind of stuff, or is that like completely irrelevant to this?
I think so. I mean, Jack Kennedy was not a religious man. He didn't go to church except if, you know, coerced. So I don't, and certainly compared to Bobby Kennedy, I mean, Bobby Kennedy did go to church. Bobby Kennedy was an observant Catholic. JFK was not. So I don't think it's a factor.
I think if I recall, there's at least one book that says the Pope killed President Kennedy.
I remember reading this book a long time ago, but by Vincent Bugliosi on the Kennedy assassination. But he came up with 42 groups, 82 assassins, and 214 people have been accused at one time or another of killing Kennedy.
We had a joke, and it's a lot of variations, sort of like that. Yeah, you know, we've identified 121 of the 3 assassins.
There's a great Onion headline. 43 assassins, 12 suspects, and all of that. You know, I mean, but if you think about it, the idea that there's a lot of stupid JFK conspiracy theories, that doesn't prove that the president wasn't killed by a conspiracy. That's a logical fallacy. And to refute stupid conspiracy theories, to me, is a way of avoiding the disturbing fact pattern. So that's why I don't like to talk about conspiracy theories at all. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about conspiracy law. I'm not trying to put anybody on trial for conspiracy. I'm not trying to take away anybody's liberty. You know, I'm not filing criminal charges. I don't have subpoena power. So the whole conspiracy discourse, both as you know, woo, you know, and also conspiracy as conspiracy law, a very specific thing. I try to not frame the discussion around those concepts because I don't know them and I don't think they're useful.
And the Warren Commission, we've spoke about it tangentially, but can you just tell our listeners what was the Warren Commission, how many people were on it, how were they selected, etc.?
So the Warren Commission consisted of 7 people, was appointed by President Johnson. Johnson, after the assassination, there were all these investigations were popping up all over. The local authorities in Dallas were talking about bringing a conspiracy case. Congressional committees were talking about launching their own investigations. Johnson wanted to get it all under control. So the editors of the Washington Post that week, right after the assassination, floated the idea of a high-level commission. And Johnson comes around to it in conversation and then starts and goes and asks, you know, people to be on it. Earl Warren, Richard Russell, senator from Georgia, was his mentor, so he wanted him on it. John Sherman Cooper was a Republican senator from Kentucky, but he was personally friendly with the Kennedys, so he was somebody who he wanted on it. He wanted Dulles on it to protect the CIA. Hale Boggs was a leader of the Democrats, Southern Democrat, so Johnson could count on him in that way. So, you know, these were leading figures of the establishment who were picked to control the investigation.
Mm-hmm. And future President Gerald Ford.
And Gerald Ford is minority leader in Congress, so you have a leading Democrat and a leading Republican from Congress, 2 senators, somebody from the CIA. So, you know, it was a hand-picked group, and Johnson had signaled that he wanted to find Oswald the lone gunman. He'd signaled that, and the members of the Warren Commission understood that that's what the president wanted.
And as much as you have looked at this, are there any comparisons with the Warren Commission and the 9/11 Commission?
I think the 9/11 Commission compares very favorably with the Warren Commission. I think the 9/11 Commission's findings are very defensible. There's aspects of that story that we don't know everything about, but I think, you know, they identified, you know, what happened. People say, "Oh, Jeff, you're interested in JFK. Is 9/11 a conspiracy?" And I say, yeah, it was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy organized by this guy, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. It was bankrolled by this other guy, Osama bin Laden. And, you know, that's what happened. Yeah, it was a conspiracy. It was a jihadist conspiracy to attack America. And the 9/11 Commission showed that. And, you know, yes, there's doubts about the 9/11 Commission, but there's a lot more doubts about the Warren Commission than the 9/11 Commission. So I think that, you know, that the 9/11 Commission definitely did a better job.
And is there anything else about this issue with regards to the intelligence community that you think it's important for our listeners to understand? Does this go beyond the CIA? Are we talking about, I think, the Defense Intelligence Agency, or maybe not long created then, the National Security Agency, other parts of the military intelligence and so forth? Or are we really talking about the CIA when we talk about intelligence and the Kennedy assassination?
I mean, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The president was killed by enemies in his government, and those probably included intelligence personnel. Which agency they were from? I mean, we don't know who they were, so I don't think we can, you know, address it with that kind of specificity. I would say there's no evidence the DIA was involved. There's plenty of evidence the CIA knew lots about Oswald. So, you know, is there other things that need to be known? I would connect the Kennedy assassination to the larger trend in U.S. policy and this different direction that was taken after, and that's significant, that Kennedy was going one direction and the country in its foreign policy, especially in overseas interventions against nationalist movements, was very different after Kennedy was dead.
So it almost seems like you're saying, Jeff, that Kennedy diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis and delivered a peaceful resolution to it, but the price that he paid was his own life.
Yeah, I think that Kennedy's moves in '63 mobilized his enemies against him.
So the NSA was created only a decade earlier from the assassination. The DIA had just been created, literally. You don't generally hear too much about either of those agencies connected to the Kennedy assassination, other than the NSA of Martin and Mitchell, who were two NSA analysts who defected to the Soviet Union during the Kennedy administration. The only other organization you generally hear about is the Office of Naval Intelligence, because Oswald was a Marine, and the U-2 flights that were being flown in part out of Atsugi, Japan, where Oswald was based for a little bit of time. And then, of course, you hear the FBI, and the FBI is involved with lots of intelligence operations here in the United States against the Soviet Union and communism, et cetera. J. Edgar Hoover, obviously, big anti-communism, communist. But it's really just the CIA that you generally hear about in this context. You know, you mentioned Vince Bugliosi's book. It's definitely one that I would recommend. I knew Vince. He was a friend. It's very, regardless of what one thinks about it from a conspiratorial standpoint, it's one of the more researched and detailed. I mean, the book itself is like 900 frickin' pages. And then there's
1,200, 1,500.
Then there's a CD-ROM that comes with it that has like 900 pages of footnotes. I mean, I remember first talking to him and his research staff in the early 90s. He spent like 30 years literally working on this book almost. So it is a great wealth of resource for even the most conspiratorial people to read, because you want to read who has the most information and assess it for yourself. I mean, there are conspiracy books like 6 Seconds in Dallas. I absolutely would, even though it's an early book, I would absolutely recommend, because Tink Thompson, did a good amount of research that's
really, he was
that's
the first person to really analyze the Zapruder film carefully from a forensic point of view. He did a much more careful job than the Warren Commission, and that's why it was one of the early eye-opening books, because he had done something.
But we do need to have Jeff talk about, I always misprint, Joanides.
George Joanides. Yeah.
Right? Because this is from an intel standpoint, and this is where one of the unanswered questions and things that came to light as a result, in particular, of the Records Collection Act, I'll tee it up. I mean, here it is. Here's this person who's assigned by the CIA to liaise with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and unbeknownst to anyone on the House Select Committee, including Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the committee, we learn years later, and this is where Jeff's research takes off on it, that Joanides was one of the guys monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald and had connections to it.
Yeah, so this was a story that emerged at the very end of the review board. I remember I got the facts in the Washington Post newsroom in November 1998. The review board no longer existed. And a friend of mine on the board said, Jeff, there's some documents coming out and you should look at them. And so he said, you can get them. So I got them from the archives. And this man identified this man, George Joanides, as the case officer for the Cuban Student Directorate, and that the members of that group had been in touch with Oswald before the assassination. And so his name was revealed in these about 10 pages of documents for the first time. Those documents also said that he had been the liaison to the House Select Committee in 1978. So I knew Blakey a little bit, and I called him up and I said, Bob, did you know this guy? And he said, yeah, Joanides, he was in the Office of Legal Counsel, and he was the point man when we wanted to do interviews or get documents. We would go to him, and he would make it possible. And I said, well, did you know what he was doing in 1963? And he said, no, we had an agreement with the agency that we didn't want anybody who had been operational back at that time to be involved in our investigation. And I said, well, Bob, look at this paper. He was running the Cubans who were all over Oswald. And when Blakey's investigators, Gayton Fonzie and Dan Hardway, asked Joanides, well, who was running the DRE in 1963? They were looking at the answer to their question. And he said, I'll get back to you. So it was Blakey says it was a felony. It was an obstruction of his investigation, an obstruction of Congress as a felony. So it was a brazen, deception of the second JFK investigation, the House Select Committee investigation. This is why the CIA doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt anymore, in terms of, trust us. If you do something like that, you're not cooperating with the investigation of a murder of a president. It's that simple. And there's nothing theoretical about this story. And there's a whole file on Joanides that's never been released. So, that's a lead. To me, that's a live lead in this story.
Yeah, no, this is a perfect example where Jeff and I absolutely fundamentally agree.
Yeah.
And the CIA has, and the U.S. government writ large, as so often is the case in these types of situations, are their own worst enemies. They've created the distrust and the disinformation by undertaking such actions such as that without explanation or knowledge. This was found out years later, and that is unacceptable. And it throws into doubt anything that they do or say. That's why, like I said, I routinely deal with the FBI, the CIA all the time, represent its people all the time. Have lots of friends at senior levels, and I may trust the individuals. I don't trust the institutions. And I've had them lie to me countless times. That's the nature of their job, their business. And I see constantly cases where I know they're withholding information. I know they're lying about certain things. And it makes it difficult to formulate a rational, logical position knowing things like that. And we can look. This case historically is very much about, there's so many different angles that as we're talking about today. And it's separating that intel angle of, okay, did the CIA play a role in the assassination? One angle. Versus what did the CIA do to contribute to the questions that exist today? Much, much larger story, and I think a much better, more legitimate, absolutely credible concerns that people have that the CIA misled, distorted, lied, withheld information from the various investigations throughout the course of history, including the review board during the 1990s.
Yeah.
On that note, I want to thank both of you gentlemen for a really interesting tour de horizon of the Kennedy assassination and the intelligence community. I know we've barely scratched the surface.
No,
it was a surface that needed scratched.
No, we have covered a lot, and I think there's a very good conversation because, we're laying out, what happened? What's the debate? What's the meaning of this evidence? And how do we understand it? That's still a live question. People want answers. People come up to me all the time, and sometimes the questions are ridiculous. Did Jackie kill? But other times it's like this enduring curiosity. I just was, dealing with a guy on a totally different subject. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I write books about the CIA." Next thing you know, he's like, dives right into this conversation. That's like basically a stranger to me.
Mm.
And he was like well-informed, curious, tell me this, tell me that. So it's like, it's a thing out there. It's still a live issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully this podcast will give people the tools to approach this issue and ask intelligent questions and so forth. But thanks ever so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of SpyCast. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy the show, please tell your friends and loved ones. Please consider also leaving us a 5-star review. Coming up next week on SpyCast.
They couldn't really figure out what was wrong with Markov until someone was looking at an X-ray and saw a little fleck on the X-ray and saw that there was a very small pellet, smaller than a fingernail, that had been lodged in his leg, and this contained ricin.
If you have feedback, you can reach us by email at spycast@spymuseum.org or on X at INTO SpyCast. If you go to our page, thecyberwire.com/podcasts/SpyCast, you can find links to further resources, detailed show notes, and full transcripts. I'm Erin Dietrich, and your host is Dr. Andrew Hammond. The rest of the team involved in the show is Mike Mincy, Memphis Vaughn III, Emily Coletta, Emily Renz, Afua Anakwa, Ariel Samuel, Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, and Jen Eigman. This show is brought to you from the home of the world's preeminent collection of intelligence and espionage-related artifacts, the International Spy Museum.